into the supreme court of the headmaster's study. I cannot tell you whether Dr. Lionel Carey derived any erotic satisfaction from whipping my bare behind with his wagger, a very thin cane, but no stranger to the tankard and the carafe. He was always in fiery mood after lunch, which is when he liked to execute his penal duties. Looking down his bright red nose, he gave me chapter and verse on my degeneracy, and then, obliging me to bend over, whacked my little arse until my buttock cheeks burned and my eyes watered. Well, that'll teach me. Quite a number of our teachers had served in the war, which might explain the insistence on severe discipline, regimented protocols, and the occasional eruption of violence, and there was no more military character at Bromsgrove than my housemaster from my second term onwards. Broome was a sort of holding house for new boys, and as soon as the space was freed up, I was transferred to Gordon, in the heart of the school, run by, or rather commanded by, the fearsome John Headley, quite possibly the hardest man I've ever met. Headley was a former Chindit, a proto-special forces unit that had specialized in deep jungle warfare against the Japanese in Burma. You didn't make it into the Chindits unless you had a character forged in fire and iron. He was also recruited into Special Operations Executive, SOE, working as an agent and saboteur behind enemy lines, and wrote a book about his wartime exploits. Terrifying, yes, but John Headley was a decent man, hard, but always fair. He was, however, no fan of the guitar, the Rolling Stones or the Who, and it was over my obsession with music that we often clashed. When the Stones released their rousing version of Chuck Berry's Come On, I played it over and over. When I was senior enough to have a room of my own, I was allowed to practice my guitar for an hour in the evening, but I didn't always stick to the exact letter of that rule, and frequently found myself standing in his study, forced to hand over the instrument. I had 2 guitars at this stage, an acoustic and a bass, and both spent much of their time at Bromsgrove, gathering dust in John Headley's broom cupboard. "You and your infernal banjos, Ilsley," he'd fume. "You really need to knuckle down and apply yourself to something useful. Where's strumming a banjo going to get you in life, eh?" Many years later, after my father passed away, I found letters that Headley had written to him, expressing his concerns that my love of music was seriously undermining my performance at school. The phrase "infernal banjos" is used several times. It was true that I was unlikely to secure a place at Oxford or Cambridge, but I wasn't a complete failure. I had 2 years in the first 15 rugby team. Being tall, I was a great asset in the line-out. I also broke the school record for the discus. And through Headley, I was appointed head of the CCF Combined Cadet Force Band. He saw it as an opportunity for me to be drilled in some proper music. To be fair, he was right to be worried about me. I was a bit of a failure in my academic studies. I was something of a dreamer, always staring out of the window, thinking about girls and music, sneaking away to the attic for a crafty smoke, or when I was a bit older at weekends, down to the pub, where we'd buy bottles of pale cream sherry out of the back door, then sit in the field and make ourselves sick drinking it. In spite of the harsh Victorian-style regime, the school did manage to produce a number of successful creative characters, the most well-known being the poet A.E. Housman. The actor Trevor Reeve and the writer Nicholas Evans were there at the same time as me, proving that the school cannot have completely neglected its development of the softer subjects and pursuits. Further evidence that the culture of the school was changing was underlined by its appointment of a new art teacher, Don Faulkner, a man who was to have a huge influence on me, and one I admire like few others. We've remained great friends ever since. He made an instant impression on me when he walked into our first class that morning, hair trailing over his collar and holding an acoustic guitar. We all looked at each other in amazement. A teacher with long hair was not a common sight in English schools then. "What are you gawping at?" he asked. "Well, sir, you're holding a guitar." "Very observant. And I'm going to sit down and play it. Will you get on with some painting?" "But what shall we paint, sir?" "For a start, you can move all those desks to the walls and turn this into a proper art room, and then get yourself some paper, some paint, and some brushes, and get on with it." "But what shall we paint, sir?" I repeated. "Whatever you damn well like. Use your imagination, your powers of observation. That's what artists do, you know." Well, this was different from sitting in serried ranks of desks sketching an empty wine bottle for a still life. It was one of those moments in life when the perspective shifts. My view of the world was never quite the same after that first encounter with Don. We all picked up our brushes. As we let our imaginations do the work, He sat in the corner looking cool and strumming Bob Dylan tunes. I was 16 then, in my third year, and from that day on the art room became my sanctuary, a refuge from the harsher world beyond. It was the day I realized there was always a way out of whatever hell you might find yourself in. There was always sanctuary somewhere, be it in art, music, or the company of a good man, or woman. "I'll be here all the time," Don said. "Come in whenever you like, even if you just want to hang out and chat." The older I have become, the more I have come to respect John Hedley, but at the time it was very hard to imagine him making the same offer, and I needed no second invitation from Don to indulge in his company and enjoy his outlook on life and art. The world needs all sorts of different characters to function, but at that moment in mine, I was way more receptive to the Don Faulkners than to the John Hedleys. After that, I didn't feel so bad that music and art were pretty well my only interests at school. I no longer felt like a failure. I could search without guilt or shame for who I really was and wanted to be. Over the coming weeks, then months and years, Don made me realize there were other ways to be happy, to be successful, to be who you are. I'm sure we have all had these angels who dropped into our younger lives and pointed the way. Don Faulkner was mine. And it was just as well, because I flopped in all my mainstream academic subjects. I had the excuse of being a June baby, one of the youngest in my year, but there were others born around the same time who did perfectly well and way better than me in their exams. It was just because I came from such a secure and loving family, I didn't feel I needed to prove myself. Maybe it was my love of music, because truly that was my only great passion then. It had a way stronger pull than the visual arts, and I lay awake every night with my radio, and was always borderline imbecilic with sleeplessness in the morning. The easy answer was that I was thick, but I wasn't. I was no scholar, but I was no dunce either. Whatever. Who the hell knows? But the fact is that I screwed up my O-level so badly, I had to retake a year. I sailed through in the second time, but then I took only 2 A-levels. I got as close to a Z in physics as you can, but got an A in art, thanks to Don, an incredible teacher who drew superb grades from his pupils, not by sticking to the curriculum, but by rebelling against it. He taught us more about life than the rest of my teachers put together, and I can still hear him today. There's no single, absolute prescribed way of doing anything, only your way. It's all down to you, who you feel you are, who you want to be. You're in charge. Don's philosophy was invaluable, and so it would prove, but the fact that I had only one good A-level meant I had no chance of getting into university or even art college, while William got into Loughborough. You needed 2 strong A-levels, which seems mad now. Surely a proficiency in art should be sufficient to get into art college. What use would a C in physics be? With hindsight, though, I'm quite pleased about the way things went. Had I scraped into art college, it's highly unlikely I'd have experienced the rich life I have. I could have ended up painting watercolours in the Market Harbour area and playing Slade covers in the Nag's Head at Christmas time. Nothing wrong with either of those pursuits, but they weren't for me. Music and art. Music and art? I was 18, and frustrating though it was for my parents, they were my only true interests. I'm 70 now, but nothing has changed. Music and art, music and art. Looking back, there were 3 big moments in my time at Bromsgrove, moments that nudged my life in a different course to what might have been expected. Meeting Don Faulkner was a huge life-changing moment, but the manner in which I joined my first band was another. Will had started one, with himself and Hugh Mason on guitar, Charlie Sowden on piano, and Paul Turner on drums. I was desperate to join, but with 2 guitarists already, a year older, and that much cooler, there was no way in. Once again, Will gave me the leg up in life. Why didn't I become a bass player? But I don't have a bass, I protested. It's okay. I'll make you one. God, I love my brother, because that's exactly what he did. He built me a guitar, and 10 years later, I was playing bass in Dire Straits. It's amazing, isn't it, how life turns on these small moments. And my brother's band needed a regular guitarist, as I'd hoped. I'd have jumped at it. I'm not bad, but I'm not a brilliant guitarist like, say, Mark Knopfler or Keith Richards, and it's highly unlikely I'd ever have enjoyed a career in music if I'd stuck at the acoustic or electric guitar. I couldn't have known it at the time, but although the fact that Will and his mate, Huey Mason, had first dibs on the regular guitar slots in the band was a major frustration, it turned out to be the most important turning point in my life. If it hadn't been for that, God knows how my life would have panned out. At first, I took off the two top strings off my acoustic, the B and the E, put on a pickup, and bashed around on it, working out the notes as best I could, and it was a good education, learning the bass so crudely. Then William, a great craftsman with any materials, built me a bass guitar, a very presentable one, with all the correct frets and strings. It was a fine piece of work, but as he admitted, it did look a little like a garden tool, so it became known as the Spade. I wish I'd kept it, rather than chucking it when I moved on. I couldn't have known what an important artifact of my personal history it was to become. But I do have a picture of me playing it on stage at school in our band, The Knot. Yeah, The Knot. A small moment in the history of popular music, but a massive story for us at the time. How cool were we? We had amps and everything, albeit ones that created less noise than the average home speakers today. And we played in front of the whole school on Saturday evenings before the screening of the weekly film. Me doing all the singing because none of the others knew the words, and they were all too shy. We played only covers, like The Animals' House of the Rising Sun, Cream's Spoonful, The Who's Can't Explain, and my favourite, That's All Right Mama by Elvis. It was all a bit of harmless fun, certainly not the first deliberate step of a career move. It was cool to be in a band, and as I wasn't brilliant at much else at school, it was a little chance to grab some self-worth, lap up some kudos. The most important thing to come out of it was the launch of my love affair with the bass guitar. I quickly understood its importance in relation to the harmonic structure, that a song falls apart without the bass and the drum holding the rhythm together. Most kids want to take the starring role of the lead guitar, but the bass was perfectly suited to my temperament. At this time, I didn't want to be the guy at the front of the stage. I was happy to hang back and be the guy trying to hold it all together, bringing a touch of order to the chaos. I can't say for sure that music and art gave me more confidence, made me stand a bit taller, but I strongly suspect they did. We all need to feel good about something, and I do know that in my last year I felt strong enough to take a moral stand, something I would never have dreamed myself capable of just a year earlier. I stood up to John Headley, Major J.G.H. Headley, a man who made you feel sorry for the Japanese fanatics he battled in the jungles of Burma. I went along to his study with a couple of other house prefects and told him we were no longer prepared to administer beatings to the junior boys. He went completely nuts, raving about how we were tearing apart the moral fabric of the school that had existed for centuries. "I'm sorry, sir, but we no longer want to do this. It just doesn't feel right." I'm as proud of that as I am of anything I did in my school years. Chapter 4. Girls and Gigs. The 60s seemed to bypass Market Harbour. They took one look at the place, the flat caps, Clydella shirts and tweed skirts, and seeing that their work would be cut out, swerved off in search of more pliable locations to convert to a fresh outlook on the world. The decade was also to leave the lightest of footprints on Kettering, one of Britain's less remarkable towns. It was to the technical college there, 12 miles down the A6, that I ended up being sent either to further my education or to finish it, my parents pursuing the logic that any qualifications from any institution had to be better than none. Kettering Tech was not exactly Balliol, Oxford, but as it turned out, I quite liked it for that. It was certainly a relief to be out of grey flannels and starched collars and studs. It was with great pleasure that we, the Leavers of 1968, tossed away our straw boaters on Saturday, 29th of June, the school's end-of-year commemoration day, and streamed out of the school gates. We were happy as skylarks and horny as rams, like convicts after a long stretch, breathing the fresh air of freedom and thrilled by the adventure of a life on the outside. 3 months later, I was putting on a new pair of jeans and a charity shop suit jacket, getting into my Ford Popular, cost £10, and heading in the other direction to the leafy squares of Bromsgrove and into a slightly depressed industrial town famous for its production of shoes and boots and not much else. For a year, in a rather half-hearted sort of fashion again, I set about trying to get A-levels in English and physics. But to get me where? My father wanted me to follow him into banking, but I knew in my guts that wasn't going to happen and that some sort of showdown was looming. So what was I going to do? I knew I'd have to work that out at some point, but for a year I was happy enough to drift about the tech and head out at lunchtime to eat burgers and drink shakes down at the Wimpy, the place to hang out in Kettering. After classes, I'd sometimes head to the snooker club with some mates, the second coolest place to hang out, but more often hit the pub or the Wimpy with the girls. Girls! Wow! I'd barely met any. Straight out of an all-boys school, I was mesmerized by these exotic creatures, having been denied access to their company for so long, but now sharing the same classroom. After 8 years in the exclusive company of boys, I now spent most of my free time rubbing along with the female of the species. I'd never had a female friend, but now I had a whole bunch, and frankly, they were probably the only reason I kept up my studies at the Tech and didn't pack up to find some sort of apprenticeship or employment. You grab what fun you can when you can, and girls, burgers and snooker, they were all way more fun than reading Milton and trying to master the mysteries of electrical circuits and the structure of the atom. Today I'd probably find those subjects quite interesting, well, quite, but back in the day, my sweet lord, it was dull. It all seemed so irrelevant. Girls, on the other hand, seemed very relevant indeed. It's so hard for school leavers to know what to do with their lives. How can they? They've had no experience of life. For all I knew, I may have had it in me to become an outstanding boat builder, bookbinder, or bicycle designer. But how was I ever going to know where my talents and interests lay when I knew little else but the insides of a classroom and a textbook? I just knew I had to hang in there, without upsetting my slightly concerned parents too much, try not to stare out of the window as much as I did at Bromsgrove, and, well, just see what turned up. And that was pretty much my life plan and vision of the future at this stage. No point looking beyond the burgers, the birds, and bashing the black over the bays into the top right corner. Change and progress might not yet have come to Market Harbour and Kettering, but they certainly came to my bedroom and my burgeoning record collection. This new wave of music, the charge led by the Beatles, the Yardbirds, and the Stones, was so different to what had gone before in popular music. For a start, you never really used to get bands, apart from big jazz bands. You just got a singer with a rhythm section tucked somewhere behind in the shadows. The singer wore a suit, grinned into the camera, and crooned into the mic, wooing housewives everywhere with songs written by someone else. But these new songs were being penned by the people actually singing them. The songs felt so fresh, coming from the heart, from true everyday experiences, that I could relate to them directly in a way I had never managed until then, or even felt was possible. Listening to American rhythm and blues on Radio Luxembourg as a kid was massively thrilling, but I had no idea what the performers were singing about, and I didn't really care. It was the sounds. Even Elvis, who I loved, never spoke to me. He was an exotic, a rebel, a medium to convey me into another universe. But from about 1963 onwards, I lay on my bed in Stonehenge, staring at the ceiling, thinking and feeling. Finally, someone is singing to me, for me, about me. No kidding, the first time I heard the Kinks' You Really Got Me, it was as close to a religious epiphany as I've ever had. At least up until then. I never heard anything like it, for the simple reason that nothing like it had ever been written before. It was a similar experience with The Who's My generation. The music of the 60s is spoken of as a revolution, but it was as much an emotional revolution for the people listening to it as it was a shift in cultural taste and musical form. These new bands gave voice and validation to young men like me. I'm not a dewy-eyed retro idealist about the 60s. It was all about the music for me, nothing else. I didn't give a toss about the fashion. Sure, it was fun to watch the one brave girl in Market Harbour who dared walk down the high street in a miniskirt, and as with the Asian lad 10 years earlier, witnessed the whole scene around her freeze in horror. But decking myself in some sort of tribal uniform never crossed my mind. I'd had enough of uniforms. Today, when they put up some footage about the 60s, all you get is guys in Afghans, everyone on the spliff and acid, and flocking to Carnaby Street. My only experience of that was the odd snatch of sassily dressed London youths in a news report on telly. I plugged into the 60s by going to gigs as often as I could. My first was to see Joe Cocker and the Grease Band before I started at the Tech. Incredibly, he was playing in a field right outside Market Harbour. Woodstock it was not. Honestly, there can't have been more than 30 or 40 people there, but he sang as if he were playing to 20,000. It was just after the release of his cover of the Beatles with a little help from my friends, and I was blown away, watching him shaking with passion as he belted it out. In 1967, I saw the Jeff Beck Group at Hinckley Town Hall, with Jeff Beck on lead, Ronnie Wood on bass, Ainsley Dunbar on drums, and on vocals, Rod Stewart, who came on stage swigging from a half-full bottle of whiskey. Rod and Jeff had a big row halfway through the set, because Jeff kept changing chords and messing up the key for Rod, who became enraged and started screaming at him. But it didn't stop the show, although it looked like it might at one point, with the two of them squaring up. It was by far the loudest music I'd ever heard, booming through huge Marshall speakers, my insides shuddering from the vibrations. Most amps and speakers then were paltry compared with what was to come. A home music system with good speakers today can generate roughly the same volume as many gigs back then. Very loud music was rare, and to hear it that night shaking every atom in my body and rattling the fixtures and fittings was quite an experience. Even louder were The Who, playing the Granby Halls in Leicester in 1968, and coming on at the end to cause utter mayhem after great little sets from Joe Cocker and a brilliant but little-known Leicester outfit called Family. The Who only played 4 songs, and then devoted the rest of the night to smashing the stage to pieces, the crowd joining in with the destruction down in the auditorium. I stood there dumbstruck, watching guitars being broken in half and stabbed into speakers, cymbals flying, and all the while John Entwistle on bass calmly playing on amid the chaos. These were heady experiences, and in hindsight, I guess they were changing me in an imperceptible way, nudging my life in a direction without me being aware of it. The gig that probably made the greatest impression was Jimi Hendrix at the Gaumont in Worcester in April 1967. Outside of a small circle of music fans, Hendrix was largely unknown at the time, and he was the third or fourth support act to the Walker Brothers. Also on the bill, completing the weirdest of lineups, were Cat Stevens, the Tremolos, and Engelbert Humperdinck. Hendrix played Hey Joe, Purple Haze, Like a Rolling Stone, and Wild Thing, and you knew you were in the presence of a very original and special talent like nothing else out there. I had never seen or heard anyone play a guitar like that, and I'd certainly never seen anyone set fire to one, but that's exactly what he did during Hey Joe. As with The Who, it was one of those electrifying, slightly terrifying, awesome experiences that was to stay with me forever. Hendrix's reputation grew after his performance at the Monterey Festival a couple of months later, but it was about a year and a half later in January 1969 that he burst to national prominence. Jimi and his band, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, were performing on Lulu's Prime live show, Happening for Lulu, and I was at home on the sofa tuning in as I did every week. After a brilliant version of Voodoo Child, the band were working their way pretty lamely through Hey Joe, when Jimi pulls up and says, "We'd like to stop playing this rubbish and dedicate a song to Cream." Lulu's face was a picture. All this going out live on the BBC, with half the country watching. The supergroup Cream, with Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce, had split up in late November 1968, bringing the curtain down on one of the most influential bands of the era. That was sensational news, and it had been slow to filter through. Jimi and his band then played a brilliant version of Cream's Sunshine of Your Love, and I can feel the tingle and shiver now as I recall my astonishment at the news and at Hendrix's bravado and brilliant tribute. As soon as it was over, we were all on the phone, frantically pulling at the slow-moving rotary dials. "Did you see that? Did you see that?" This was the year of the first moon landing, but Hendrix on Lulu was my moon landing. He got banned by the BBC for this outrage, but he couldn't have cared less. The following year, he was dead. The plan had been to keep the knot going after the other 4 members had left school. Will heading to Loughborough Art College to study furniture design, and the other 3 going straight into jobs. We managed to play a few gigs the following year, the only memorable one taking place at Market Harbour Rugby Club. It was staged in the home changing room shortly after the players had finished scrubbing up after a match. The dirty brown water was still in the big communal bath when they chucked a few boards of plywood over it, and we took to the stage to set up. Necking yards of ale and aftershave, the rugby boys couldn't have cared less if we'd played covers of Bill and Ben, the Flowerpot Men, and Puff the Magic Dragon. But we did okay, and I have to add the acoustics were as good as any I've played in a small venue. That was pretty well the end of the line for the knot. It wasn't exactly the same as Cream or the Beatles calling it a day, but it was still a sad realization. It was my first band. I learned to play bass, albeit fairly crudely, but above all for me, it was the thrill of playing live and the satisfaction of making a steady improvement. I had come to realize that music was always going to have to play some role in my life. In what capacity or at what level, I had no idea, and the thought of being in a proper band never crossed my mind. But having played the bass and mastered the basics and a bit more, it was right there in my bones and soul now, and would stay there for good. I was always going to play music, and I was always going to be a bass player. At Kettering I searched for bands to join, but there weren't a great many to be found. In fact, there wasn't a great deal of anything that might be considered fun or creative to be found in Kettering at the time. I played in a three-piece blues band for a bit, with a half-decent drummer and a good guitarist who played nice and bluesy, trying to imitate his hero Eric Clapton. But we were fairly crap as a three-piece, playing to a few half-empty pubs, changing our name after every gig in case word got around about how poor we were, and the next landlord declined to book us. I moved on to what might be loosely termed a soul band, with a Saxon trumpet player and quite possibly the only Chinese guitarist playing in a British band back then. He was one of the first Chinese to study in the UK, and probably the most memorable feature of that microscopically small footnote in British musical history. I'd like to tell you that at least my studies were a roaring success, but they weren't. Far from it. I failed both A-levels. No surprise for physics, as I didn't even bother turning up for the exam. They say that if you're going to fail, make sure you fail big. I certainly didn't disappoint on that count. My parents may not have seen my latest academic catastrophe as a smart move, but maybe, just maybe, my intuition, my gut instinct knew what I was doing. Deep within, I think I had an unarticulated feeling of horror about the conventional, provincial life that my parents, like all parents, praying for their child's security, wished for me. So what the hell now? First up was to face my parents. They didn't give me a rollicking, it was worse. They gave me disappointment, powerfully expressed in glum and anxious faces. Dad in his armchair, knocking out his pipe as if trying to knock some sense into me. Every parent will know what they must have been thinking. What are we going to do with this child? I knew I was going to have to pay some sort of penance for my flop in the classroom. I wasn't so inconsiderate as to fail to appreciate the sacrifice they had made in spending all their hard-earned money on educating their children. I had hardly given them a great return on their investment. My father rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said, "Well, John, I suppose it's the workplace for you now. I've taken the liberty of making a few calls." My heart was freezing and sinking. "And there's a place on the Marks and Spencer's management training scheme. It's a great opportunity. What do you think?" What was I to say? "You can stick that one, Dad." So I said, okay. Off I trooped in my suit for a series of interviews, and incredibly, having got through the first three, I was in there for the fourth and final, and it was going just fine. There were three men with grey hair ranged behind a long table, and I was answering one of their questions, when the bad cop among them interrupted and, I guess trying to throw me off balance, asked, "How do you go upstairs?" "Sorry, I'm just answering your colleague's question, sir." "I don't care. What's your answer?" "Well, I'd walk upstairs, I suppose. Maybe take the lift, if there was one." "Wrong answer. You'd run up them." So I failed that too, and I was back for another chat with Mum and Dad in the sitting room at Stonehenge. "John," Dad said gravely, "I spoke to some friends in banking, and there's an opening at Lloyd's Bank in Rugby." Nightmare scenario, but my mother's face was creased and pleading again. What to say? Okay, I'll give it a go." It only lasted a month, but it was without doubt the most miserable month of my life. Thank God for the Beatles' White Album. I played that over and over every night until the needle almost bored its way through the vinyl. Truly, it saved my sanity. The White Album and my guitar, which almost grew a voice to beg me to give it a rest. I'd handed in my notice at Lloyd's after a week, but had to serve out another 3. A word of advice: don't go back to the 60s and become a trainee bank clerk in a provincial town. I've never read Dante's Inferno, but I'm guessing that experience would be one of his outer circles of hell. So more disappointment, more uncertainty, more frustration at living at home, no money. For beer and cigarette money, I took a job working in Symington's, the soup factory, down in the town. I was the dog's buddy tasked with cleaning out the mixing machines. Being an accident-prone dreamer, one evening I forgot to turn off the machines I was cleaning, and I put my hand into it. There was a terrible grinding noise, and a bolt of quite unbelievable pain. When I pulled my hand out, my right thumb was hanging off just below the nail, and I was rushed to the hospital in Kettering, a very good one, thank heavens. The surgeon said he wasn't sure whether to take it off or sew it back on. "I'm a guitar player," I said. "Put it back on, please." So he obliged, mercifully. Half an inch deeper into that mixing machine, and I'd never have played a guitar again, and my whole life would have turned out entirely differently. It was clear that Market Harbour wasn't really working out for me. I had to get out before it was too late. But where could I go? My thumb mended, I went to play a 21st birthday gig for my mate Paul Turner, the drummer in the Knot. I got talking to his dad, who owned a timber business in Wolverhampton, telling him I was at a loss as to what to do for work. I was keen to move on somewhere, anywhere. He said he had contacts at a huge timber importer and distributor in London that he bought all his wood from, and he'd give them a call. A week later, I was packing up the Ford Popular in the drive at Stonehenge, a bag of clothes, my guitars, my records, and the dance set. I'm not sure if it was relief or anxiety that was etched on my mother's face this time as they waved me off. Probably a bit of both. I loved my parents, and it was not them I was running away from with such joy. I just wanted a life. I wanted adventure, so where better to start looking for it than London? I'd heard a few times that when you're bored of London, you're bored of life. The move sounded good. But would I find what I was looking for in a timber company in Erith in Kent? At least it wasn't that far from London. Chapter 5. Timber and Tenements. It was the summer of '69. I'd just turned 20, and my train was rattling through the bleak dockland landscape of south-east London, Bermondsey, Millwall, Rotherhithe, Deptford. It wasn't until many years later that I was to discover that I was missing out on a giant hippie party. While I was staring out of the window, slightly aghast, so this was swinging London, the rest of the country was apparently walking around naked, smoking weed, making love, and wearing daisy chains. I'm afraid the summer of '69 would pass me by. It was only about 15 miles from Charing Cross, but my journey from London took over an hour, and you had the impression the driver was slowing up every now and then to wind down the window and have a chat with a mate. We pulled into Erith, a place so ugly it made Kettering look like Vienna. It struck me as a sensible act of self-preservation to take off my tie as I made my way through a scene of post-industrial desolation to the timber yard of Burt Bolton and Hayward, BBH. Safe inside the gates, I put it back on and got lost among giant stacks of poles, planks, and shaved tree trunks until finally I found the prefab office building. "So why are you here?" said Dennis Holland, a friendly old chap with a massive RAF moustache and florid complexion. "You're the second person to ask me that today. The chairman in your HQ up on the Strand just said the same. He sent me down to see you. He had no idea either. I'm here for a job." "Did he now? What do you know about timber?" "Nothing except that it's made of wood." Well, that's a start. Tell you what, why don't you become our first trainee manager? 15 quid a week sound all right?" "Perfect." BBH was a major business providing all the telegraph poles for the south of England and most of its railway sleepers. The yard was there in Erith to be close to the Thames, where the logging ships from Finland and Russia delivered their cargo, all of it unloaded by hand, by crews of stevedores whose pints you most certainly never wanted to spill. These, I was to discover, were tough, tough men that even John Headley might struggle to command. I'd done my 6 weeks training in each of the 6 departments, including the mill and the docks, before I settled into sales, and it wasn't long before Dennis called me in. "I don't know why we'd never done business with the GLC," he said. "It's the biggest employer in Europe, the biggest builder in Europe, and it's currently putting up thousands upon thousands of new houses and scything down the world's forest to do it. For some reason, no one here has ever managed to find out who buys in their timber." I got on the phone, and by the end of the morning, having been passed round the labyrinth offices of the Greater London Council, I found myself talking to a bloke called Dave. It's about fucking time someone from your fucking company phoned me. And yeah, I do buy the wood, every last splinter of it. How about lunch or supper? Great, I love food. I knew nothing about food or London restaurants, so Dennis told me to take the guy to Inigo Jones, one of the best in London, he said. Dave bought his cartoon Cockney girlfriend, we had a rare old knees up, and I got the GLC account. The deal was simple. The GLC were to buy all their timber from BBH, and I was to take Dave and his bird out for a slap-up meal once a fortnight. Who said business was tough? It wasn't long before the GLC started putting in absolutely massive orders, and Dennis was grinning so hard his moustache would have stretched from ear to ear had it not already been doing so. After 6 months, my account was worth $1 million a year, about $15 million in today's money. I'd like to claim that was down to some sort of Rockefeller business genius lying latent, but undiscovered in me. But no, I just took the guy out for steak and as much wine as he could drink. I lived in a nondescript semi-detached boarding house in a nondescript suburban street in the nondescript borough of Bexley-Heath, run by Doris, the 75-year-old landlady. I gave her £5 a week, and she gave me a cooked breakfast to floor a lumberjack, and an evening meal, usually chops and mash, sausage and mash, or shepherd's pie and peas. I spent the tenner left over from my pay packet on fuel to run the car and beer to run me. There was literally nothing to do in Bexley-Heath in the evenings, unless you had a powerful telescope to look at the stars. Dennis was kind enough to inform me there was an excellent strippers pub that did an excellent Sunday roast, a suggestion I never followed up, tempting as it was. Any change of scene would have been welcome after a few months. So for 6 months I did my work, had a few pints with my colleagues, went back to Doris for my grub, and up to my room to play my guitar and stick records on the dansette. There was very little good new music coming through. It had all just dried up, so I went back to my favourites, Dylan, Van Morrison, Cream, the Kinks, the Stones, the Beatles, the Yardbirds, Muddy Waters, and so on. I missed playing in a band, but there was nothing I could do about that for the time being. I'd become quite Anglo-centric in my tastes, but always with a leaning towards the blues. Britain had become the crucible of modern music over the last decade, absorbing the influences of different strands of American music, black and white, and mixing them into its own potent and unique sound. Once again, it was music that saved my sanity. I made the occasional trip into central London, but I knew only a handful of people in the city. There was not much point in going up to the West End to wander about by myself. A highlight should have been going to see the Stones play in Hyde Park on the 5th of July 1969. It was a free concert, and police estimates put the crowd numbers as peaking at close to 500,000. In spite of that, there was a weird and slightly depressing atmosphere, possibly because the founder and guitarist Brian Jones had died 2 days earlier, and possibly because the PA was so weak that you couldn't hear much unless you were crammed in at the front. It might also have had something to do with the unsettling sight of seeing Jagger perform in a sort of white dress. It was the first time the band had played for 2 years, and they admitted afterwards they had played badly. There was a ton of weed and booze being passed around, but far from being on a high, I slipped back on the train to Doris's for my chops and mash, feeling slightly deflated by the experience. I loved the Stones, but I was unlucky to catch them on a bad day. I met some brilliant people at BBH, and I stayed in touch and went back for drinks with them long after I moved on, but the dreariness of life in Bexley-Heath could go on for only so long, and I was on the alert for good companionship, preferably female. Around Christmas time, I found it in a girl called Diane, who I got talking to in a pub after work. My life picked up the day I met Diane, a social worker from Salford, and the only girl from her school to go on to higher education. In fact, my life changed radically the day I met her, and I soon said goodbye to lovely old Doris and her chewy chops, and moved into Diane's little flat in Woolwich. We met a strange couple at first, her being a very short working-class lass with a strong commitment to socialism, and me being a very tall, middle-class, privately educated lad in middle management with no commitment to any political cause whatsoever. Diane changed that, opening my eyes to worlds and world views that were as far from the cosy environment of Market Harbour and Bromsgrove as you could imagine. She was an activist and a campaigner, a full-on card-carrying lefty, and she inspired me to start reading and taking an interest in the wider world. I was soon reading Engels and Marx and going on Ban the Bomb marches. It's a thrill to have your mind open, I discovered, to have your conscience shaken, your horizons broadened. You can always change your mind, but just keep thinking and questioning. 2 episodes in particular blasted me out of my complacency, out of my lazy indifference to the lives and plights of others. The day she took me to Salford to meet her family was one. It was like stepping back into the late 19th century, and I loved it for showing me the real world. Not much could have changed, that's for sure. There was row upon row of red brick terraces in an area forgotten by industry and the modern world, blighted by high unemployment and suffering extreme deprivation. I had never been further north than Leicester, and this was a soul-shaking different world to anything I'd come across. We had an outdoor loo at Stonehenge, but we also had 2 in the house. We also had more than one fireplace, but it was not the only means of heating our home. Hers was an old-fashioned working-class home, where the front room was left unused except at Christmas. Life was lived in the little kitchen. Everyone smoked hard, drank hard, and ate chips. Fish was a treat. What struck me most was the powerful sense of community. Everyone so friendly, looking out for each other. The pub on the corner was rammed during opening hours. There were no drugs on the street, but my God, a lot of beer was drunk there. They didn't need social workers in their street, Diane said, nor any police. If a kid went wayward, he was sent round to Diane's mum, who gave him a dressing down and threatened to put her son, Fred, onto him if he stepped out of line. You really didn't want Fred put onto you. The week up there made a powerful impression on me, and driving back south, I felt a little ashamed by the good fortune I had enjoyed, and my failure not to have made the most of the opportunities I had been given. I was an altered man when I arrived back in London, and I knew that significant changes lay ahead. If I was shocked by what I saw in the back streets of Salford, I was genuinely distressed by what I witnessed in London's East End when, not long after, Diane and I volunteered to take part in the 1971 census, going from house to house, flat to flat, gathering details of people's lives to provide a snapshot of the nation's population. Dickensian is a word used so often to describe poverty and urban decay that it has become almost meaningless, but the term perfectly described the world we encountered. Our beat was Poplar and the Isle of Dogs, in what is now the business and finance district of Canary Wharf, just a few hundred yards across the Thames from the pleasant and affluent borough of Greenwich, where we sometimes went for a drink. I've been to the modern incarnation of the Isle of Dogs, with its skyscrapers and moles, and 2 worlds further removed from each other is tough to picture. The conditions in which people were living were shocking. Squalid flats for 2 or 3, inhabited by 10 or more, many of them immigrant Asian families. On most floors there was just one toilet to be shared by every flat in the corridor. In the space of a few months my worldview, if it deserved the dignity of that term, had been knocked for 6. Remember, with so little media then, you had to make an effort to be informed. No excuses, but there was a lot more ignorance or lack of awareness then. At school, I had no interest in what I was obliged to study, other than art, but now I was motivated. I was going to go to university and educate myself, come what may. After a year at BBH, I started evening classes at Woolwich Tech studying sociology to get the diploma I needed to study the same course at a more advanced level at Goldsmiths, part of the University of London, its campus up the road in New Cross on the limits of Deptford. Even on my little salary, I could afford a mortgage, and so Diane and I bought a little terraced house together in Bexley Heath and began a life of quiet domesticity, serious study, even more serious politics, and in my case, manic DIY, and loads of loud music. It was strange, becoming more comfortable materially, yet more troubled in my conscience. After I got my diploma from Woolwich Tech, securing my place at Goldsmiths, I went to inform Dennis that I was leaving the firm. He almost fell off his chair. Sociology? University? Why on earth would anyone want to do that? We're just about to make you the youngest board member in the history of the firm. And what about your account? It's doing so well. You're set up for life, boy. Don't be a clot and throw it all away. I had a lot of time for Dennis, a funny and kind man, and I tried to explain that at 23, I was too young to settle down to such a comfortable middle-aged lifestyle. I wanted challenges, adventures, to push myself, to see what else was out there, maybe do some good for others. He was genuinely upset at the prospect of losing the contract with the GLC, so I agreed to his compromise. I wasn't to tell Dave I was leaving. I'd still take him out for his fortnightly piss-up in a posh restaurant, and BBH would pay me a half salary and let me keep my company Hillman Hunter. That worked out at about 3 or 4 grand a year, and to be honest, my new socialist principles were not quite so incorruptible as to turn down funds that would see me through my studies. But in the event, I gave the job up after 6 months. I had so much more money than the other students, it didn't sit at all comfortably with me, not least because I had a grant from the college as well. I wanted the full grimy student experience, cold beans out of a tin and all that. It was probably inevitable that Diane and I would split up, me being in my new world with so many new friends and diversions. I was a student, she was a full-time social worker. She had changed me as a person, and I will always be grateful for her shifting my perspectives of the world, influencing me to take a different direction. She represented another of those turning points in the journey of life, another example of the serendipity that guides our destinies. Just as Will's band, having 2 guitarists, forced me to take up the bass, just as flunking my exams and failing to get into art college left me in limbo and forced me to go to London, so too had Diane pushed me down a path I could not have foreseen. She had been the most significant agent of change in my life up to that point. I did something for her too, I hope, a mellowing effect perhaps on her radicalism. Without letting up on her socialist principles and activism, she certainly enjoyed the petty bourgeois comforts of our home. We had balanced each other out, correcting our extremes, making us see the world from other sides, I suppose. When I moved out, I gave her full ownership of the house, which was worth about £12,000, in return for a couple of grand. Within a month, a friend of a friend moved in with her, and I believe they stayed with each other. I moved into a council flat on the Crossfields estate in Deptford, vacated by a student friend who had gone travelling the world for a year. The Crossfields was an early post-war social housing estate comprising 12 red brick blocks and split into 2 by the arched brick viaduct of the North Kent line. Each house had 5 stories, the washing slung with forgotten bunting along the communal walkways. Most of the houses had been deemed unfit for family habitation, so a great number of the residents were students from Goldsmiths, plus artists, musicians and general layabouts wanted to do not very much other than smoke weed and drink beer. I was to get to know the community very well, and it was great. There were normal working people living there too, making the community an interesting mix, and on the whole everyone got on. So I packed away my jacket and tie, threw on my t-shirt and jeans and started growing my hair. Hair I would barely cut for a good couple of decades. It was a 10-minute walk to college in the morning, up Deptford High Street, past the Sally Army Hostel, all the tramps emerging for the day, and over the railway line into New Cross. If you were to come back late at night from the Union Bar, when all the shops were boarded up, it was advisable to do so in a group. Drunk, stoned, dreamy students were easy prey. Mum phoned up a lot at first, worried to death about me having chucked in a solid job to go broke and live in a run-down council flat. Having proved myself at BBH, I think they understood that I knew what I was doing, and let me be, to work out life for myself. I was as happy as I'd ever been. Finally, aged 23, my life was beginning. For the first time, I was living it on my terms. I was fully de-institutionalized, free from family pressure. I was smiling and laughing a lot more, and, incredibly for a student, I was out of bed on time every morning, excited to head into college. I was making friends fast, and not just because in the first few months I still had some BBH cash to splash at the bar. There was one unsettling incident in those early days that shook me up and left a dark cloud hanging for a while. One evening I came back to the flat, up on the 4th floor, to find that my door had been kicked down. Entering hesitantly was as if Charles Manson and Jackson Pollock had dropped in after an acid and scrumpy bender. The whole place had been smashed to pieces, including a bunch of my favourite records. There was blood on the floor, ceilings and walls. On the wall was painted, "John, you're a fucking bastard." I was completely freaked out, and went and stayed at a mate's. It turned out that a girl I'd slept with not long before had a boyfriend, and a very angry one, judging by his interior decorating skills. It was one night stand, and I had no idea she was attached, so when she told me, I sought him out on the campus, apologised and explained. He was really cut up. The good news was that they stayed together, and he and I became mates. Sort of. It was the only trouble we ever had on the estate. Despite it housing a mixed bag of characters, who had been thrown together from all walks of life, and it had come from the Goldsmiths crowd rather than the locals. Knowing my friend was coming back from her travels, I needed to find a new place to live. I was delighted to see a notice on the Goldsmiths board offering accommodation in another flat on the Crossfields. I was loving it there. It had become my home, every other night spent in the Oxford Arms with the more alternative residents of the community. I moved into number 1 Farrer House, which had a mattress on the concrete floor, but as yet no furniture, as promised by the council. Even though it had 4 bedrooms, it was one of the flats deemed unfit for family habitation. There was a small gas fire in the sitting room, a 50s gas stove in the kitchen, a payphone, and a pay-as-you-go electricity meter. My BBH money long since gone, I was soon as skint as the rest of them, and the rent being £9.48 a week, I started to hunt for a flatmate to share the burden. A mate at college said he knew of a local social worker. Half the population of South East London at the time seemed to be social workers, and he said he'd get him to give me a call if he was interested. A couple of evenings later, the phone rang, and incredibly, I was in the flat and not in the Oxford Arms. "Hi, is that John? I'm Simon's mate. You said you might have a room going free on the Crossfields." "Well, it's not free, mate. It'll cost you £4.78 a week. But yes, you want to come and check it out? It's fine, I know those flats. I've done work in them. Okay to move in Sunday?" "Well, sure, yes, yeah, whenever you like. What's your name, by the way?" Dave Knopfler." "Dave what?" "Knopfler." Dave turned up as arranged, and I was delighted to see he was carrying a guitar case. Chapter 6. Mr. Knopfler, I presume. The mid-70s are often regarded as the lowest point in modern British history, but for me they were as happy as any years of my life. The Heath Conservative government had declared 5 states of emergency in 4 years. There were crippling strikes, spiralling inflation, collapsing stock markets, militant union barons with more power than the political parties, dirty and unreliable trains, and erratic malfunctioning telephones. Power cuts were an accepted part of life. The IRA was exploding bombs all over the place. Football hooligans were running riot. The skinheads of the National Front were menacing immigrants. There was graffiti and litter everywhere, and street upon street of terrace houses were being bulldozed to make way for brutalist tower blocks, which people thought were the answer to every community's problems. London was more of an eyesore than it was in the Blitz. Everywhere you looked, it was shabby and decrepit. Nothing really worked, and every day the headlines in the newspaper spoke of a once great country in severe decline and on the point of total collapse. But down in Deptford, we were having a ball. Maybe it was because Deptford was so far ahead in the race to the bottom. There can have been few districts in Britain so unglamorous, so deprived, but on the Crossfields estate and the Goldsmith campus, we didn't care, so long as we had enough money to buy beer, fags, and the odd bag of weed. I loved Deptford, its greasy spoon cafes, its ancient pubs, its friendly tramps, its haunting history with all those derelict warehouses and rusting dock machinery up the creek towards the Thames. There was a bleak but beautiful poetry to the place, and it had a strong beating heart to it, the attitude being, so we live in the shithole, but it's our shithole. After the heyday of the 60s, the general music scene in Britain had become fairly uninspiring in the early to middle years of the following decade. There was lots of experimental rock in the album chart, and the singles chart was dominated by lightweight, insipid, easy-listening pop songs, very few of which were to stand the test of time. The Bay City Rollers were being hailed as the new Beatles, and Terry Jack's saccharine Seasons in the Sun topped the charts for a month in early 1974. Enough said. This was also the golden era of the novelty song, the Wombles, the Wurzels, and comedy actor Windsor Davis with Whispering Grass. If you loved your music as much as I did, there wasn't a great deal of new talent out there to drop onto the turntable. Bowie, Cockney Rebel, and Eric Clapton were the only contemporary acts speaking to me. I took refuge in my favourites, J.J. Cale, Muddy Waters, Bob Dylan, Van Morrison, B.B. King, Leonard Cohen, Cream, the Stones, the Kinks, and of course the Beatles. Part of the problem was that most of Britain's best rock stars had fled overseas to avoid eye-watering punitive tax rates, which were a real problem back then. The Stones had scarpered to France, Bowie to New York, Rod Stewart to California. It was a full-blown exodus, and it was no surprise they were in headlong retreat. Thin Lizzy's single, The Boys Are Back in Town, and the album Jailbreak earned them £200,000, about £2 million today. But after tax, they ended up with just over 30 grand for the whole band before deductions for their management team and agents. They'd worked hard to finesse their craft, sacrificed a stable life, brought great joy to many people for posterity, but they were being paid like apprentice dustmen. Elton John, whose early albums with lyricist Bernie Taupin I really enjoyed, was the best-selling artist of the day, shifting about 30 million albums in 1975 alone. Everyone presumed he was drowning in money, but he was receiving only about 3 pence in every pound. It was barely worth him getting out of his four-poster and clearing his throat. Great that he's done okay since, but he certainly wasn't coining it in back then. These were highly charged, highly politicised times, perfect for studying sociology at Goldsmiths, in the golden era of stereotypical bearded lefty lecturers, and it must be said, virtually no female lecturers. It was a very left-leaning university, my department especially so, but the ideological fervour I had embraced with Diane waned a little. I soon realised I didn't want to be a card-carrying ideologue of any stripe, and I never have been since. Maybe it was the sight of one of my militant socialist lecturers pulling on his corduroy jacket and getting into his BMW at the end of his short day, off to bang one of his female students. Maybe it was meeting up for drinks with my old mates from BBH and suburban Bexley Heath, all good people, capitalists all, I'm sure, but hard-working and decent, just trying to get on and earn a crust. I wanted to learn as much as I could. I wanted to open my mind as much as I could, and I worked pretty hard, but I never joined a party or a society at Goldsmiths, never got involved in a campaign except once, I think, for cheaper beer at the Union Bar. It was not until I got to Goldsmiths that I realised that the people I had encountered at BBH, the teak-tough dockers and stevedores, as much as the office and yard employees, had opened my eyes to the world every bit as much as the academics, activists and ideologues of the university. They were real people, doing real jobs and living real lives. I wasn't going to let politics define and restrict me. I may have been living in a small world, but the world of my mind had become a much bigger space, and I wanted to treat people as I found them, whatever their political affiliations. David Knopfler turned out to be a perfect flatmate. We shared the same sense of humour, as well as a love of music. He was off social working by 8:30, and in our area of London, he wasn't ever short of work. I was off to uni for 10, and having our own sets of friends, it was a pleasure when our paths did manage to cross. He was a very open guy, willing to talk about anything. We had an easy relationship, but similar musical tastes, and from time to time, we strummed guitars together. After the wilderness years of Bexley Heath, where guitarists were thin on the ground, playing music was making a strong comeback in my life. Uni gave me plenty of time to improve my technique. There was a bunch of bands on campus who I messed around with, and more than just an attraction to her character and looks, it was no surprise that my next girlfriend was heavily involved in the music scene. Jean was in the year above me at Goldsmiths, but also ran an agency for folk singers up in Kentish Town. She'd recently broken up with the singer Bob Davenport, from the northeast like her, and a big name in the world of folk. He was a friend of Bob Dylan's and had played with him on a number of occasions. I didn't know much about folk, beyond Dylan, Joan Baez, Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, and I knew next to nothing about the English scene. Jean introduced me to the leading players including Martin Carthy and the Watersons, and the extraordinary guitarist Richard Thompson from Fairport Convention, who came to have a big influence on me. People can be sniffy about folk, as they can be about poetry, but even if you don't like it, you can't ignore its importance in our musical tradition and its influence on rock. If nothing else, for me it helped open my mind and widen my musical tastes. In a moment of madness in October 1974, Jean and I decided to open a record shop in the vacant outlet below her agency on Kentish Town Road. We called it Honky Tonk Records. The name was inspired by the DJ Charlie Gillett show of the same name on Radio London. We wanted to sell the best of the new music that wasn't getting airplay anywhere, just as Gillett was trying to play it to his audience. Charlie was one of the few DJs on the radio playing anything new, alternative, or little known, and anyone with a true interest in music, that is, music outside of the charts, tuned into him religiously every Sunday. He was interested in albums, not singles, artists, not trends, anything that he rated, and he played a lot of the music I loved, like Little Feat, Ry Cooder and J.J. Cale, and new UK bands like Ian Drury and the Blockheads and Graham Parker and the Rumour. More in Wild Hope than in expectation, I wrote to him at Radio London asking if he had any suggestions for our stock list. I was truly surprised when I received a reply almost by return of post, with a really encouraging letter and a very long list of recommendations. Jean and I probably weren't the most driven of shopkeepers, not being there much of the time, and the shop closed its doors to the sadness of nobody in May 1975. I'd like to say we gave it a proper crack, but we didn't really. Lazy students. Little could I have known that just 2 years later, Charlie Gillett was going to re-enter my life and have the most sensational impact upon it. The music scene at Goldsmiths was pretty vibrant, and every Saturday night some decent acts came to play at the Students' Union, including the great British blues player John Martin, a big name of the day. It's a gig I remember vividly, mainly because the brilliant Danny Thompson was on double bass. I was mesmerised. By then I was playing in a blues band of my own, a three-piece, drums, guitar, and me on bass, and we called ourselves Blind Alley. We were very excited about all the